Good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Pennington. I'm the head of the Department of Political Economy and also the director of the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society, which is hosting the event this evening. We need to acknowledge thanks to the King's Worldwide Partnership Fund, who are funding tonight's proceedings. One of the key themes that the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society addresses is the relationship between rationality and governance institutions. Are governance institutions a rational response to various social dilemmas, or do they reflect, to some extent, non-rational forces, and what may be the implications of our different understandings of the nature of rationality and their relationship to institutions? It's in that context that we are very honoured to have with us this evening Professor Jon Elster. Jon is Robert K. Merton Professor of Social Sciences at Columbia University, and I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that he's one of the world's leading contributors to debates surrounding the methodology and philosophy of the social sciences, the strengths and weaknesses of rational choice theory as an explanatory tool, and a host of other core political economy questions relating to matters of distributive justice and constitutional design. Among his many publications, we can refer to Making Sense of Marx, Nuts and Bolts for the Social Sciences, Ulysses and the Sirens, The Cement of Society, and most recently, Securities Against Misrule. Tonight, he's going to be speaking to us about emotions in history. So please can we give a warm King's welcome to Professor Jon Elster.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for inviting me. So this is my program. If I digress too much, which I usually do, I may skip some of these sections, but I think Mark will probably be able to make the whole PowerPoint available to anyone who should wish to look at it. If you look at these case studies that I'll be studying, they have an explanation. I'm in the middle of writing what will be, if it turns out to be doable, a 3-volume study comparing the French and American constitution-making experiences in the 18th century in Philadelphia and Versailles and Paris. So I've started out thinking this should be a 1-volume discussion. It ends up in 3 volumes. The first, I just sent off to the publisher, is called France Before 1789. The second that I'm working on right now is called America Before 1787, and the third will be called, appropriately, I think, 1787 and 1789, where the actual comparisons will take place. So that's why I have chosen these particular cases to illustrate my general approach. This is the causal structure of an emotional episode. It looks sort of complicated, and it is, because emotions are complicated, but I think the takeaway from this diagram should be that the main causes of emotion is a belief, for instance, that somebody has harmed me, so I get angry, and the main effects of emotion is an action tendency that may then develop into a full-blown action. We can get back to the details of the diagram in the Q&A if anyone wants to discuss the nitty-gritty. So this is structure of rational choice, and you can see it's much simpler. It has some of the same elements, action, desires, and beliefs, and gathering of information, where the feedback loop of information reflects the fact that we often stop gathering information when we have found what we seek. So the barred arrow from desires to beliefs basically bans wishful thinking from rational choice, whereas here there's plenty of scope for wishful thinking, as we all know. Okay, so here are some differences. There are many, probably, but here are some. between emotional choice and rational choice. So emotions generate urgency, that is, a desire to act sooner rather than later, and this may cause suboptimal gathering of information, leading to irrational beliefs, low-quality beliefs because based on insufficient information. Emotions typically, but there are many exceptions that we can discuss, have a short half-life, causing preference reversals. Emotions typically make people ignore the second fact, acting as if the emotion would never subside, what George Loewenstein called the hot-cold empathy gap. And finally, very importantly, emotions can induce irrationally optimistic or irrationally pessimistic risk assessments. Anger and enthusiasm tend to induce irrationally optimistic risk assessments, and fear and anxiety, irrationally pessimistic risk assessment. In addition, I don't include this here, but I think it's in the main diagram. Well, no. In addition, emotions can affect degree of risk aversion. So anger typically makes people less risk averse and also induces more optimistic risk assessments. So this is just sort of to give you a feeling for what these emotions are and what they do. Anger is what A feels when B harms A, either because of reckless indifference to B's welfare. No, A's welfare, sorry about that. There should be reckless indifference to A's welfare, collateral damage, or because of an intention to harm B. And the action tendency in both cases is for A to punish B. Indignation, that Descartes distinguished first from anger, is when A feels when observing B harming C. And the action tendency is to punish B, but less strongly than in anger. And Ernst Fehr and his team in Zurich have demonstrated empirically that people do punish at some cost to themselves second-party actors who harm third parties at some cost to themselves. But they are spending less money on punishing in indignation than in anger. Envy is what A feels when observing that B possesses a good that A wants, in a double sense of lacks and desires, and the action tendency is to destroy the envied good, and if necessary, its possessor. Enthusiasm, what A feels in face of a highly worthy goal. The action tendency to sacrifice personal interest and welfare for the sake of that higher goal. So this is a little discovery I made. If you read textbooks, handbooks, Google Scholar, you will essentially, and search for emotion and enthusiasm, you will essentially get 0 hits. Psychologists don't study enthusiasm, but I think we all know what it is. We have experienced it not just in being enthusiastic stamp collector, enthusiastic supporter of regime change, like in Tahrir Square. They were enthusiasts. And so I think this is an interesting case where I think that history can contribute something to psychology, not just the other way around, which is obvious. Fear, what A feels in the face of an impending and certain danger. Action tendencies, fight, flight, or freeze. And anxiety is a different kind of fear, or what A feels in the face of a remote and uncertain danger. Action tendencies take precautions to avoid or eliminate the danger. So this is sort of maybe too long, but I use PowerPoint as a kind of crutch because I'm not a very good speaker, so I use PowerPoint as a crutch. You'd have to live with that. So urban anger in the French Ancien Régime. I came across something interesting. The International Handbook of Anger says that typical triggers of anger include frustration, threats to autonomy, authority or reputation, disrespect and insult, norm or rule violation, and a sense of injustice. So what I'd like to focus on a little bit is the difference between norm or rule violation and a sense of injustice as triggering anger. And I think I will only use the first episode here. A coachman, I use the second. In the second episode, a footman was condemned to the pillory and the galleys for having spoken freshly to the mistress of his master, the noble captain of the Swiss Guard. When he was led to the pillory accompanied by 200 archers, They were met by a crowd of 5,000 or 6,000 people who destroyed the pillory and broke the windows in the captain's house, where he had retrenched himself. Several persons were killed. The next day, when the footman was taken back to the pillar under guard, nothing happened, perhaps because the emotions had abated. Although a commoner himself, the person from whom I take this, the diary of the lawyer Barbier, he shared enough of the noble values to comment, "It was good that justice was done, for footmen are already too insolent." So here is the key difference between anger of the urban elites, born of a violation of the norms of hierarchy, and anger of the people, born of the perceived injustice of those norms. And I make a contemporary analogy here between, on the one hand, white supremacists, and on the other hand, Black Lives Matter. Only the latter is based on sense of justice, the former is based on the elite's self-perception as superior. So that's many such examples. Rural anger in the French Ancien Régime has been very extensively studied quantitatively. So there are 3 books of the French Ancien Régime, which I think offer the most systematic studies ever of anger in history. So in a book on the long French rebellion from 1661 to 1789, Jean-Nicolas analyzed 8,528 episodes of popular violence. The French word for rebellion also include émeute and émotion. And these were of various kinds. As you see, I've highlighted the 1497 subsistence rebellions and various other rebellions. Jean-Yves Berset, in a more intensive than extensive monograph, wonderful book, found 31 rebellions against the high price of bread, compared to various other rebellions and their causes. And in a computer-coded study of 4,689 insurrectionary events in the French countryside from 1788 to 1793, John Markov found 36 with an anti-seigneurial character, 16% related to religion, 26 to subsistence crisis. So you can see subsistence crises are very common triggers of rebellions, understandably enough. Although, hunger is not an emotion. Its immediate action tendency of hunger is to obtain food, if necessary by force, but violence against persons is not a primary aim. Yet a subsistence crisis can also, as a secondary effect, induce emotions which can trigger an attack on persons over and above what is needed to get food. So I came across, while I was writing this, more or less, an article on the internet introducing the new word to me, hangry, H-A-N-G-R-Y, anger caused by hunger. This was a perfect example of that. Hunger can be transmuted into anger, because it's generally true, it seems, that people prefer to explain bad events by an account involving human agency, rather than by impersonal natural forces, such as bad weather. And the Ancien Régime, the most important manifestation of this agency bias was a tendency to explain the high price of grain by the actions of hoarders and speculators, rather than by poor harvests caused by bad weather. So I have a few quotes here to that effect. Towards the bottom here, Berset, "The hunt for those who starve the people had a reassuring function. Calamities from heaven are too horrible to imagine. One prefers to discover a responsible in flesh and blood, to hunt out the author of a catastrophe. The right response to the need to find human causes for an impersonal disaster." And I think that's a very general human need, to find agency, because agency provides meaning, rather than action just being sound and fury told by an idiot. I think that's one of the many forms that pattern seeking can take, both in social agents and, I'm afraid, in some of the authors studying them. So, enthusiasm. I use the Oxford English Dictionary definition: rapturous intensity of feeling in favor of a person, I'm going to skip persons, principle, cause, etc., passionate eagerness in any pursuit proceeding from an intense conviction of worthiness of object. It's a state close, I think, to that of hypomania, again the OED, characterized by elation and a feeling of well-being, together with quickness of thought. And clinical signs include supernormal energy, as well as subnormal needs for food and sleep. So, it's a wonderful book published in 1789, still one of the best books on American Revolution and Revolutionary War, because he was so close to the events and actors, by David Ramsey. And he constantly emphasizes the importance of enthusiasm. And both that enthusiasm was completely unfounded and that it was crucial for the momentum of the revolution. If it had been for this unfounded revolution, the Revolutionary War founded enthusiasm, revolution would never have gotten off the ground. For instance, an ardent military enthusiasm unabated by calculations, that is, rational choice, didn't enter into it at all, and enthusiasm of the day that the colonists gave up both their personal services and property to the public on the vague promise that they should at future time be reimbursed. Now, a more complicated case, which I've discussed in a couple of articles, is the night of August 4, 1789, in the French Constituent Assembly, when the French framers essentially abolished feudalism overnight. Now, as many observers at the time, and historians such as Tocqueville have argued, there was a mix of enthusiasm and fear in the framers, because many of the framers held properties in the countryside which were under attack during the Great Fear of 1789. And so they had a very personal interest in giving up some of their feudal privileges to pacify the peasantry. Of course, they miscalculated, because when you make a concession, that just triggers demand for more concessions. But I thought they would pacify the peasantry in this way. So they were behaving irrationally, I think, when responding to the peasantry with concessions, but that's what they did. But some of the measures they took on that night were not due to self-interest or fear for their properties. When provinces abolished their privileges, or towns or cities abolished their privileges, that was not due to any kind of self-interest, but to some kind of contagious enthusiasm. They were, as was said about another such event in the assembly, drunk with disinterestedness, and including, of course, a competition among the framers to be more disinterested than a neighbor. It was a competition to be the most disinterested. So, is that really disinterestedness? To appear to be disinterested? No, I don't think so. So it's a bit tricky. So here is a couple of instances of the short half-life of enthusiasm in the American Revolution. So Ramsay says that in the first years of the war, the mercantile character was lost in the military spirit of the times. But in the progress of it, the inhabitants, cooling in their enthusiasm, gradually returned to their former habits of lucrative business. Because enthusiasm enables people to, or makes people ignore their short-term, petty, and partisan interest, and really for the sake of the public interest. But because of a short half-life, you cannot really count on it durably. And here's another letter by George Washington, writing to a member of his staff about the failure of the plan to arm the slaves in the fight against the British. George Washington said, "I must confess that I'm not at all astonished at the failure of your plan. That spirit of freedom, which at the commencement of this contest would have sacrificed everything to the attachment of its object, has long since subsided, and every selfish passion has taken its place." So enthusiasm can be crucial, but you cannot count on it in the long run. If I had time, I would have also discussed the role of enthusiasm in the making of the constitution of my country, Norway, in 1814, which also was carried out by unfounded enthusiasm, which turned out to be crucial for the adoption of the constitution. But I have written about this in various places. So let's look again at the night of August 4th, 1789. 4 effects of enthusiasm. Because of the short half-life of emotions, we might expect to see a preference reversal after a cooling down period. The main monograph on the events by Patrick Kessel cites numerous instances of Monday morning blues. Second, because of what George Lowenstein calls the hot-cold empathy gap, you might expect that when adopting the decrees, the deputies did not imagine that they would ever change their minds. they ignored the rules that the Assembly had adopted just a few days before, requiring constitutional matters to be discussed on 3 successive days. Those who wanted immediate action said that an élan of patriotism does not need 3 days, and since one cannot vary in such sentiments, the 3 days would be a pointless waste of time. So, when this is more general, Gibbon makes the same point. When assemblies or individuals try to protect themselves against their passions, the passions override these protections. So because of the urgency induced by emotion, desire to act immediately rather than postpone action to gather more information, you might expect the deputies to vote immediately rather than taking the time to verify the news from the provinces about castles burning, nobles being killed, and so on. Although several deputies insisted on the need to wait to confirm the truth of the reports, the Assembly overrode their objections. And finally, as I think I mentioned, because the tendency of emotions to induce irrational optimism or some emotions or wishful thinking, you might expect the deputies to believe that the peasantry will be appeased by concessions. But this was indeed their assumption, contrary to the tendency for concessions to generate a demand for more concessions. A fact, a tendency of which some of the wiser deputies were fully aware, but nobody listened to them. So, this is about fear in the calling of the Federal Convention in 1787. So, about fear, first, important to distinguish between 2 forms of fear: rational fear or prudence on the one hand, and visceral fear on the other. So when I say I take my umbrella because I'm afraid it's going to rain, there's no fear involved, just a rational choice given the beliefs about the rain and my desire not to get wet. But visceral fear is something different entirely, and it can distort cognition, and it can shape preferences and other things. So I think the American Constitution was a constitution of fear, and I think the American Constitution-making process was a process of fear, and the document itself is a counter-revolutionary document. It is directed explicitly, in many ways, against the, in the eyes of the framers, excessively democratic state assemblies that suddenly thought they could be free, since they were free of George III. So this is a controversial interpretation, less so today than it would have been 10 years ago, I think. But I think it was a counter-revolutionary document intended to counteract this basically non-existent threat of democracy. So the immediate trigger for the calling of the convention was Chase's rebellion in Massachusetts in 86-87, which encouraged merchants, politicians, and generals who desired a stronger national government. And one very important merchant, Stephen Higginson, wrote to his friend Henry Knox that a rebellion must be used as a stock upon which the best fruits are to be engrafted. Never let a good crisis go to waste, right? And Knox, in turn, wrote alarmist, exaggerated, and persuasive letters to his friend George Washington. And logically enough, some nationalists then expressed the hope that the violence would not be crushed too quickly. Should the insurgents begin to plunder, wrote a general, it would have a good effect. So they're basically stirring up fear to gather momentum for a calling of the convention. So it seemed clear to me, and also seemed clear to Thomas Jefferson at the time, that the framers overreacted to Chase's rebellion. So here is a famous letter to William Smith on November 13, 1787. Jefferson was in Paris. He wrote that our convention has been too much impressed by the insurrection of Massachusetts, that is Chase's rebellion. And in the spur of the moment, they're setting up a kite, a hawk, to keep the hen yard in order. I hope to God that this article will be rectified before the new constitution is accepted. I don't know which of the articles citing a rebellion he has in mind. There are at least 3 of them. But it's clear that he thought the framers adopted the article in question on a sudden emotional impulse in a certain moment, that is, out of fear. And if you read the debates at the convention, wonderful reading, 1,000 pages more or less in Madison summaries, they also show a high level of anxiety based on an irrational fear of democracy. And Elbridge Gerry, for instance, was the most articulate or forceful, rather, representative. I'll skip some of the other stuff here. This is really not so much based on just these two countries and assemblies, but a more general theory of constitution making. So I'm going to spend a little time on that. Let me see what I have here. So this is a theory I proposed in an article in Scandinavian Political Studies 2 years ago, called Emotions and Constitution Making, which, as I said, goes beyond the two countries, France and America. First, an empirical claim: constitutions tend to be made in times of crisis. And here is some evidence for that. There's only one counterexample where there is a successful constitution making, but no crisis. That is Sweden in 1969 to 1974, when they abolished the bicameral constitution and replaced it by a unicameral constitution, and took the occasion to modernize the constitution in other ways as well. But in the part of the world that I know well, the North America and Europe, this is a unique case. Otherwise, crises are needed for constitution making. So I say, there's an upper left-hand corner, US 1787, France 1789, many others. Virtually all the French constitutions fall under this heading: 1795, 1799, 1814, 1830, 1848, maybe not 1870, but certainly 1958. There are two interesting examples from Canada which show that if there's no crisis or perceived crisis, constitution making fails. So both the Lake Meech Accords and the Charlottetown Accords failed in various ways because, as Peter Russell says, there was no perceived crisis. And then bottom left-hand corner, there was a crisis, but to this point at least, yet no constitution, because the Icelandic parliament tabled the constitution that had been ratified by a referendum on the grounds that referendum was not mentioned in the constitution. So anyway, so these, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, there are various other examples from Germany, post-communist assemblies, and so on, and I think they all fall into this pattern that there was a crisis. So that's the first proposition. The second proposition is that crises tend to go together with strong passions, because it's hard to define exactly what we should understand by a crisis. I haven't really been able to do so conceptually in a very rigorous way, but they include things like civil war, defeat in war, bankruptcy, implosion, such as happened in communist countries post-1989, and various other things that can reasonably be called crisis, perceived as crisis. Certainly, yeah. So is Brexit today a crisis? I don't know. We had a conference in Oxford a couple of weeks ago when that was discussed, whether Brexit has sufficiently crisis-like characters to trigger this willingness to disregard personal, petty, short-term interests. So happy to discuss this if anyone has opinions on the subject. Now, third, strong passions tend to undermine rational belief formation. Now, that is implicit in what I said already about how anger and enthusiasm might induce excessive irrational optimism, and fear and anxiety, irrational pessimism. So the irrational pessimism was instantiated at the Federal Convention, I think, and the excessive optimism was instantiated in the making of the Norwegian Revolution of 1789, and also, I think, in the French Assembly of 1791. So let me just mention briefly one episode from that assembly, the French assembly. On May 16th, 1791, Robespierre made one of his great speeches in the assembly, urging the framers, deputies, to declare themselves unelectable to the first ordinary legislature. Basically saying that we have to make certain not only that we don't write a constitution in our self-interest, but that we are not perceived as possibly doing so. So a very rhetorical speech. It was not motivated by disinterestedness on Robespierre's part. He predicted correctly that the new assembly would be made up of inexperienced deputies, almost by definition, and that the Jacobin clubs would take up with the seat of power. And the reactionaries, in fact, sided with Robespierre in the sense that they believed that the king will be able to dominate these experienced politicians. Maybe he would have if it had not been for the flight to Varennes in June 1791. Whatever, the outcome was that, as I said, it was a disaster, and it shows that enthusiasm can be disastrous. It can have good effects, more or less by accident, as in the American Revolutionary War and in Norway, but by and large, if enthusiasm leads to false beliefs, acting on false beliefs usually is not a good thing. And in this case, the deputies who ignored the risk of inexperienced politicians were essentially basing themselves on wishful thinking. Now here comes what I think is a more, perhaps, I don't know, surprising statement. Only strong passions can generate the political will needed for constitution making. That is, only in the grip of strong passions are people willing and eager even to ignore their, what I have called their short-term petty and partisan interest. So, if you combine propositions 3 and 4, you get 5. Constitution making tends to be flawed. With some exceptions, but without passion, as Kant said, nothing great has ever been done. He specifically says that about enthusiasm. Without enthusiasm, nothing great has ever been done. He also says that enthusiasm undermines rational belief formation. He says that more or less in so many words. So he was aware of the tendency that I mentioned earlier for enthusiasm to generate desire for good ends, but a choice of inappropriate means. So the combination of 3 and 4 is, well, as I see it, I could cite many examples from various constitution-making episodes that constitution-making tends to be flawed. Let me see what I have here. This is just evidence for proposition 2. This is what I've said already. Emotions undermine cognitive rationality by no number of mechanisms, urgency, motivated belief formation, and the hot-cold empathy gap. Now, this is evidence for proposition 4. Once passion abates, partisan self-interest resume a dominant role. And Tocqueville wrote that the French revolutionaries of 1789 boasted their own strength with that proud confidence that often leads to error, evidence for proposition 3, but without which a people is capable only of servitude. They had no doubt that they had been summoned to transform society and regenerate the human race. These sentiments and passions delivered them from individual egoism, fostered heroism and self-sacrifice, and in many cases made them indifferent to all the petty goods that possess us. So they lead to error, but they deliver us from individual egoism. So which of these dominates? Sometimes by luck, as I said, it may be desirable, but in other cases, tragically, like Tahrir Square, the constitution-making process in Egypt, they got something worse than what they had already, because they, in what I assume would be irrational optimism, they thought they could change the process for the system for the better by manifesting in the streets. I haven't made a study of this, but that's more or less what I assume. Okay. So proposition 5 follows more or less immediately from 3 and 4, but that the process is flawed doesn't necessarily imply that the document it produces is flawed. That may be so or not. Now, what is a flawed constitution? There is no generic definition of that idea, but here are some possibilities. One can understand it as an intrinsic instability or inefficiency of the political system, as in the French Constitution of 1848, which basically set an omnipotent assembly against an omnipotent president. It couldn't work, and it didn't. Or the American Articles of Confederation, which were unstable or inefficient, rather, because they couldn't prevent free rider behavior by the member states. That's one of the reasons for the crisis, and also one of the reasons, long story, behind Shays' rebellion. One could also understand the idea of a flawed constitution along normative lines. If it creates a narrow of suffrage or eligibility, skewed appointment, regressive tax system, and so on, all of these presence of these flaws may also destabilize the constitution. The fact is not the only reason why there are flaws. Whether or not they have a destabilizing effect, such constitutions are flawed because they fail the test of impartiality. I think at least whatever a constitution should be, it should treat people impartially, should not be slave to interest or to prejudices. Now, on other normative grounds, one could argue that a constitution is flawed if it has a strong status quo bias, either because it's very difficult to change it or because it's very difficult to get an effective majority. The American Constitution has both these flaws. So take just Congress. In Congress, there are 5 veto points. First, of course, there is bicameralism. Second, within the Senate, there's a veto by the supermajority that's required. Then there is, of course, judicial review. Then there's presidential veto, and something that many people in the US don't know, maybe you do, the so-called Hastert rule, which makes American democracy into pure travesty. The Hastert rule, created by former Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, says that the Speaker can prevent a bill from coming to the floor if he thinks that a majority of his majority would reject it. That is, in theory, 26%. Majority of a 51% majority could block a bill from even coming to the floor, even if there's a large majority in the House for adopting it. So 5 veto points explains a lot, I think, about American politics, and also, of course, the incredible difficulty of amending the Constitution. Must be the most hard to amend Constitution anywhere, I think, except those that are unamendable. So explains also many of the pathologies in the American system, including the Senate itself is a pathology because, as you know, Wyoming and California, with respectively 700,000 and 35 million inhabitants, have the same number of senators, namely 2. And that cannot be even amended, except by the consent of the state who loses its equal number of senators, which of course will never happen. So it's a... now, okay, so, but that may be, this may be setting a target that's too unrealistic, because what you really would like to ask, even if the constitution-making process is flawed, couldn't the constitution that results be superior to the previous constitution? And that is something that is obviously the case in America. The Articles of Confederation were much worse in many respects, unstable than the constitution that was finally adopted. And I think one could argue that the Fifth French Republic is flawed in many ways, which we could discuss, but I think it's clear that overall it's superior to the constitution of the Fourth French Republic, which was basically impotent to act because of various features of that constitution. Well, looking at some of these processes, in Germany in 1919, in the US in 1787, in France in 1958, it's clear, I think, that haste is a source of many flaws. The need to do something quickly, urgency. Now, urgency and haste don't have to be bad things. If there's a real urgency, you need to act quickly, because as the standard example goes, if you go in the woods and you see something on the path that might be a snake or might be a stick, better run. Don't go up close to see whether it's a snake or a stick. And similarly, if there's a real urgency, you need to have a constitution in place soon to get the government going. But nevertheless, I think that in these three cases, America, Germany, and France, there are demonstrable flaws in the constitution that can be traced back to haste in constitution-making process. The most interesting and important is the Weimar Constitution, where the conjunction of two articles, 25 and 48, had the effect of allowing Hindenburg more or less to rule by decree and then opening the way to Hitler. If the German lawyers, constitutional jurists, including, or Max Weber, also who was part of the process, had taken the time, they would have noticed this, that these two clauses, 25 and 48, each of which is harmless by itself, would in conjunction could be a recipe for disaster, which it was. I want to digress briefly by mentioning another possible cause of Hitler's rise to power. It was a selfless, disinterested act of the German Social Democrats to advocate and get adopted universal suffrage to the Constituent Assembly, including for the first time female suffrage. The Social Democrats knew very well that female voters would tend to favor conservative parties, but nevertheless stood on their program and adopted a constitution that did indeed shift the balance of power towards the conservative side, and then arguably also, in a way, perhaps paved the way for Hitler. So disinterested constitution making is not always a good thing, and since I have some time left, I want to digress a little bit more on that theme. Václav Havel in 1990 basically had a free hand with respect to how the Constituent Assembly should be elected. His personal preference was for the British system, essentially, to select eminent personalities by single-member districts without a runoff. But he was persuaded by his prime minister to adopt instead a party list, to allow the communists to be represented in the parliament, which happened with disastrous result, was perhaps the main cause of the breakup of the country, and many other bad things. So his prime minister, when I interviewed him in 1993, told me that we were perhaps the first government in history that has deliberately refrained from using its full power to promote its own interest for the sake of national unity, and not creating an ostracized communist class, which could have been a danger for the country. So in those two cases, disinterestedness arguably proved disastrous. Okay, well, I think that's what I had to say.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask if you believe there's a problem in modern politics in trying to extinguish emotion, and if that's the cause for why we seem to be in a political stalemate right now. The forces of populism are very much engaged with emotion, whereas the other side says, I want to present you the facts, and everybody else says, no, I don't care about your facts. I want the other facts. And in a sense, we need to put more emotion into politics for those who are non-populists, so we can have that sort of altruistic take.
I think there's certainly a lack of constructive emotions. They are against all sorts of things. Populism can be summarized as desire for, one definition of summary. Summary could be desire for more social services and lower taxes. Now, that's not really something that can rally, I think, enthusiasm. Now, and I don't think you can institutionalize arrangement that would promote emotions in a desirable way. In fact, I've given some examples from France and perhaps from Egypt, about how enthusiasm can have disastrous effects. So there are these two different aspects that I've emphasized a couple of times. For instance, enthusiasm, but I think also anger makes people. Well, anger is basically destructive. Enthusiasm is constructive. When those two go together, it's a very potent combination. When you have anger against the status quo, but also enthusiasm for a realistic alternative. But so focusing just on enthusiasm, as I said, it can lead to choice of desirable ends, but if the means are massively inadequate, you get the terror, or you get the harsher dictatorship in Egypt, because people are misled by wishful thinking. Now, I don't think anything can be done institutionally to promote desirable forms of emotions in the political sphere. If it happens, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't. If it happens, it may have good consequences or bad consequences. I'm just trying to emphasize towards the end of my talk here that if you want a constitution to overcome, to create political will to overcome self-interest or group interest, you have to also accept the cognitive distortions that come with that, in the choice of means.
Thank you very much. I thought that was wonderful, and the broad thesis, I'm very persuaded. I'd like to, however, put a bit of pressure on one of your claims you made in passing about the American Constitution being a counter-revolutionary constitution. Two potential ways that this could be called into question. The first, that assumes the American Revolution is indeed a revolution. There's a plausible reading of it, which is that it's...
No, I meant the making of the Constitution was a counter-revolutionary movement.
But if it's a counter-revolutionary document, that implies that there was a revolution for it to be counter to. Right? But of course, there's a view that it's a secession movement operated by a landed aristocracy who were doing it for their own self-interest. And of course, when they got the power to themselves, they were going to be counter... Right? It was never supposed to be a revolution. The flip side being... Well, isn't every constitution, by definition, counter-revolutionary? Because insofar as a revolution removes an established authoritative sovereign power, what you have to do by re-establishing normal politics is put a limit on that, draw a line under what happened before, and close off all the revolutionary tendencies. So, in a sense, on the one hand, you could question whether counter-revolutionary is the right term, because whether it's a revolution. The other side, you could say, well, of course it's counter-revolutionary. That's what a constitution is supposed to be.
Well, I think there are very few counter-revolutionary constitutions. In addition to the American one, and that's a controversial case, there are the counter-revolutionary constitutions in France and Germany in 1852, both of which were directed towards what was perceived by many who were fear, as excessively democratic 1848 constitutions. Apart from those three cases, I cannot really see any sense in which constitutions, I cannot see the other constitutions that have been counter-revolutionary in the sense of trying to counteract or even eliminate tendencies towards greater social and economic equality, which I think is what counter-revolutionaries do. They want to limit egalitarian tendencies and perhaps even restore the status quo, or in fact in Germany, before the status quo. You said almost by definition. Could you just spell out briefly what you meant by that? Because I didn't quite get the argument.
Well, I suppose a lot turns on what we mean by revolution. So if you read revolution, you mean some kind of progressive social change, then no, fine. But if by revolution you mean a revolution, a complete overhaul of the system of government and the location of sovereign power, then any constitution which comes in the wake of that has to put an end to that process. So, in a sense, against this ambiguity, if by counter-revolutionary you imply reactionary, well, again, maybe not. But I'm just kind of putting pressure on these terms. It's a little bit
I think perhaps I tacitly understood counter-revolutionary as reactionary. I think so. So, for instance, America was a clear case of 2 steps forward with the revolution and the democratic state constitutions, and then 1 step backward afterwards. And in France, you had 1 step forward, 2 steps backward with Napoleon. So, so that's, yeah. So I think that's what I meant, reactionary. Someone desiring to re-establish the status quo, or preferably actually going back to to before the status quo, because as Giscard d'Estaing said in 1975 with Le Monde, he was asked, "Do you want to go back to the conditions before May 68? He said no, because the conditions before May 68 created May 68. So he certainly didn't want to do that. So that counter-revolutionaries always want to, or desire to, go back to beyond the pre-revolutionary state. Yeah, that was usual clarification. Now, can counter-revolutionary be understood as something that is not simply reactionary? Well, I don't see it, but I have to think about it.
Thank you very much for your talk. The chart which you used to support your constitutional propositions, the chart with countries which managed to get the constitutions, looks very convincing, and you have both successful cases and unsuccessful. However, I'm wondering whether your theory is still valid when we define constitution in a broader terms, not as a formal document, but as some sort of establishing order from a disorder or perpetual state of war. And here I think about 2 levels. One is the state of kind of perpetual civil war in countries in post-colonial period, such as Africa, for example. And in a broader sense, I mean basically any sort of order emerging from a situation of disorder of war, everyone against each other. What I mean here is that whether your theory can explain successful cases of establishing some sort of order, but most importantly, how it can explain when the order does not evolve from in these kind of situations. Is it not that emotions are too strong in this case, or the rational choice come to place here and self-interest dominates the emotions? Thank you.
So can order emerge from anarchy, spontaneously, as it were? Well, historically, doesn't it take a coup or dictator to transform anarchy into order? Does anarchy ever spontaneously give rise to order? Sort of casting my mind around examples, but I don't know all parts of the world equally well, so to put it mildly. In particular, I don't know the African processes well at all. But I can't see the mechanism by which anarchy will be transformed non-violently into order. But can you?
So when I refer to the post-colonial Africa, I mean that these...
Yeah, but was it non-violent?
No. The question is that your theory explains why certain constitutions were adopted due to the enthusiasm in case of France or fear in case of the United States. However, how it deals with the situations where the constitution did not evolve. And so we have the cases of African countries which constantly involved in civil war. So certainly some kind of constitutional process is not arising there. Is it due to the lack of emotions, to the enthusiasm, or your theory will not explain the cases where the constitution does not evolve?
Well, I'm not claiming that crises generate constitutions. They're not sufficient conditions, but necessary conditions for constitution to be made. So I think maybe your question more reflects the question whether a crisis is sufficient, and I never made that claim, and I think it would be false.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. So I have one question on this slide. So if you basically go from 5 to 6, right? So if you say the constitution-making process is flawed because of emotions, therefore constitutions tend to be flawed.
tend weakly.
Weekly, yes.
Yeah.
But there was two questions actually. So one thing is, what does flawed mean in this case?
Well, I discussed that at some length. See here.
Yes, yeah. But for whom? For whom? Flawed for whom?
Well, I discussed that here. Either because they are Constitution is intrinsically unstable or inefficient, or because it doesn't pass a normative test of impartiality, or because it's immune to change, or also even prevents change from happening within the Constitution. So these are, but whatever conception of flawedness we adopt, a Constitution that is flawed because of the process by which it was adopted may be superior to preceding state of affairs. So, once again, flawed can be taken in an absolute sense. It can also simply be, if it's taken in a relative sense compared to the previous one, it need not be flawed. But in some absolute sense, for instance, not giving right to vote to women, it is flawed, obviously flawed, but nevertheless, since the Articles of Confederation didn't give right to vote to women either, and since the Constitution of 1787 was superior in other respects, that doesn't really count against, in a relative sense, the Constitution of 1787.
I was wondering, so imagine that the French revolutionaries were extremely rational. So they basically, they had this night where they abolished feudalism, and then on the next morning they said, guys, wait a minute, let's think about this more. So even if you basically have a constitution-making process that's perfectly rational, absent of emotions, wouldn't you think that that could also imply a flawed constitution? Because if the society and the legal institutions are basically out of balance, then I don't see why just the fact that you are rational might imply that the constitution that results from this is good. Isn't it more about the ability to change it afterwards organically to basically mold it closer to the society?
Well, that's one flaw of a constitution, such as the American one. It's too hard to amend.
I don't see why rationality or emotionality matters in this case.
Well, in the case of French, as I said, they had Monday morning blues. Clearly, they regretted what they had done under the impulse of emotion. And many other signs that are indicated here. I can't remember how many there were. Here. So clearly, they were emotional, not rational at all. And by the time they got the Monday morning blues, news had already gone out to the provinces about the decisions, so it was too late. Nothing could be done to change it. So it certainly was very emotional.
So this book is called Against Empathy, which argues that we just have to have a compassionate framework instead of the more empathetic framework for empathy. And I was just thinking, don't you think that we could have a rational, emotional framework that could kind of establish the same will for revolution, or maybe make a new constitution of some sort? I don't know if it might...
Rational empathy? Rational empathy. You really mean, well, I tend to distinguish between empathy and sympathy. Empathy being the ability to put yourself in another's place, perhaps to anticipate threats that the other could make. That's empathy in my book. Sympathy is concern for the other person's welfare. So which of these two did you mean? Yeah, but which of these two notions? Ability to put yourself in another's place, perhaps to anticipate the other's reactions, or sympathy in the sense of concern for the other person's welfare. The first, empathy, in my definition, doesn't imply concern for the other person's welfare at all. Just an ability to put yourself in the other person's place, as I said, to perhaps anticipate threats or that the other, or attacks. A good general has to have empathy with the enemy. It doesn't need to have, shouldn't have sympathy. So which of these two did you have in mind when you said empathy? Ability to put yourself in the other person's place, or concern for the other person's welfare? I'm just asking, so I can try to answer the question. Both? Uh-huh. Well, in the French Constituent Assembly, I don't think there was much empathy. It's Because empathy is essentially, in my definition, again, a cognitive thing. It's the ability to represent, put yourself in another person's place, to anticipate what he or she will do, including attacking you. I think that was conspicuously lacking in the French Assembly, which proceeded on unrealistic assumptions about the noble character of the people, who had now replaced the king. It was no longer lèse majesté, only lèse peuple. So there was very little clever strategic thinking. But of course there was sympathy in my definition again, but under the veil of universal disinterestedness, which in itself may have been a pretty egocentric attitude, because to the extent that people show they're disinterested, to be applauded and rewarded. So it's anyway, so it's complicated, as I say.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed your talk. I have a question, though, about the way you formulate emotion. The way you seem to you seem to understand it as something very sudden, and then it's subject to a decay function. So there's sort of a burst of emotive energy and then a decay. But I wonder if there isn't, under certain circumstances, a different way in which emotion can be formulated over time. For example, there are some types of political processes that might produce an emotion that gradually grows over time and wells up until a point where people can, so, for example, no longer stand something. I'm thinking of corruption is a phenomenon that often causes this low-level anger and resentment rather than a sudden burst of emotion. But the anger and resentment can grow over time till suddenly there's some kind of demonstrations or protests that might not necessarily lead to a constitutional change, but might lead to some major reform. And I wonder if under those circumstances you might see the emotion as being somewhat more rational, because it is a constant or steady reaction to an objective social phenomenon of abuse of power.
Let's say adaptive instead of rational. I can explain why, but I prefer adaptive. I think what you say can happen, but only because there is a steady stream of new information about corruption. If there's just one episode about corruption, I can't imagine that single episode generating an increasing intensity of emotion. But if there's a steady stream, one after another, then that can indeed be the case, that the emotion grows in intensity over time. But there are many counterexamples to the claim that emotions have a short half-life, either because it's not clear whether we should include prejudices among the emotions. Prejudices are not subject to short half-life, and that includes, for instance, contempt for lower, inferior races or individuals. But emotions triggered by an episode seem to have a short half-life, unless, as I said, we are fueled by more episodes. But to repeat, I cannot see a single episode triggering an emotion that is increasing over time. I may be wrong, this is an empirical question, but I cannot see it.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your instructive lecture. I'm very interested in your separation of the emotional choice and rational choice. Can we develop a unified framework to integrate the emotional choice and rational choice? Because emotion and rationality, both of them has proper functions in our choices. Sometimes we cannot separate emotional choice and rational choice very clearly. But I can admit that in some circumstances we can separate them, but in the circumstance of very strong emotion, we just feel we are dominated by strong emotions such as anger and fear. We don't seem to make choices, but in other circumstances, yes, choices are strongly influenced by emotions. But emotion and rationality, both of them has proper functions. Is it possible to develop a unified theory?
The short answer is, I think, no. Partly because rational choice theory is no longer a unified theory itself. So it has been replaced by behavioral economics, which shows human beings as essentially bundles of unrelated quirks with no coherence whatsoever. There's no reason why loss aversion should go together with the sunk cost fallacy or with hyperbolic discounting. These seem to be separate pathologies, as it were, compared to the rational choice model. So there's no unified, simple alternative. There's no unified, simple theory anymore. So that's why the idea of unifying rational choice theory and emotional choice theory seems a bit hard, since rational choice theory itself is so incoherent. And as I said, the picture it gives us, where economics gives us, is human beings are a bundle of unrelated mental quirks, which is sort of sad. Now, more generally speaking, have a function. Well, obviously, many emotions have a function in a survival sense. Fear is very functional. Anger to it mobilizes the organism, creates adrenaline, all sorts of other mobilizing responses by the organism. Does envy have a function? Does malice have a function? Does pride have a function? There are so many emotions. There are, I think last time I counted, there were at least 3 dozen separate emotions. So some of these have functions, others probably are byproducts of adaptations that had functions. But that doesn't mean that the byproducts themselves have been selected for. They may, in fact, have been negative fitness value for the organism, but that negative fitness value was compensated by the main effect of that adaptation being positive. So I'm very skeptical towards attempts to rationalize emotions across the board. Some, obviously, anger and fear, at least, and probably maternal sympathy.
If there's any room in your model or in your scheme for unconscious origins of emotions, because you've described emotional reactions to things which are quite palpably associated with events, but there's a whole world of unconscious modeling around, psychoanalysis being the principle.
Well, what would the evidence be for unconscious anger? Well, it would have to be or unconscious. Let's first distinguish between unconscious in the sense of non-conscious and unconscious in a stronger sense of suppressed. I assume you have the latter in mind, because the former. But non-conscious emotions are quite common. In fact, you can often see in others and in oneself, I guess, anger coming on without you knowing it. So we have all heard, and many of us have uttered the angry utterance, "I'm not angry." Or love can also creep up on people. They find themselves being in love without really noticing it until something triggers their awareness. But those are simply non-conscious emotions. They are not suppressed in the Freudian sense. I just find it very hard to find there's a master emotion which I call amour propre, self-love, which can, I think, generate, which is often unconscious. We are egocentric, but we don't know it. So I think amour propre can generate emotions such as envy, for instance. People are envious, are often unaware of their envy. But that doesn't mean they have suppressed it. They're just unaware of it. Others can see it. It's obvious that they're envious. But the person who is envious will often say, "I'm just animated by righteous indignation," which is a fine thing you can acknowledge. Envy. So, your question is important, but my answer is tentative. There is a tendency in Freud, I think, to make the unconscious too like the conscious sometimes, like as if the unconscious is capable of strategic planning and so on. Maybe, I should revisit Freud and on this point. It's a good question. I don't have an answer.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just wondering whether you could please tell us a little bit more about the notion of tendency that has been tendency. So if you could please go back maybe to the slide with the theory of constitution making, actually. So the question I was having, I mean, like, is not just what notion of tendency you might have, but also how strong that needs to be. Because under a weak interpretation of tendency, why might endorse your propositions 1 to 3 and still deny that 5 follows from them? So there seems to be a sort of trade-off in the reasoning there, why in order for the argument to go through, you will need quite a strong notion of tendency, in even probabilistic or otherwise terms. And under weaker interpretation of it, there might be easier to support, but then the conclusion would not follow from that. So could you please maybe elaborate a little bit more on what notion and how strong it needs to be? Thanks.
Well, tend is here empirical, as is clear from this diagram. It's empirical. And there are counterexamples. These are not laws, but the exceptions are sufficiently few to warrant, well, I would say a strong tendency, but not without exception. It's purely empirical. Proposition 3 is also supported by vast amount of psychological research, but of course, many people who feel strongly, passionately about something are capable of keeping their passions separate from their belief formation. So these are just frequently occurring, and very frequently occurring. But for instance, in many constituent assemblies I've studied, there is always often a minority who is not caught up in the passions and try to urge realism and prudence, but they are then outvoted by the passionate majority. So, so the strongest claim, which is sort of unqualified, is number 4. But once again, Sweden is an example of passionless constitution making. So, well, mechanisms. I've written extensively about mechanisms, which is something less general than laws, but more general than simply thick descriptions. So it's I don't want to be pressed on this point.
So in the German constitution, there's something called eternity clause. So some things can just never be changed. Would you say that the very fact that such a clause exists is an indicator of a flawed constitution?
No, not ipso facto, not by virtue of it being eternity. I think I can't see what harm dignity as an entrenched clause could make. But the American Constitution, which has quasi-eternal equal representation for states in the Senate, quasi-eternal, because the idea that a state would vote to lose one of its senators is unthinkable. So I said, all practical purposes, that is an eternity clause that is extremely dangerous, has been proven to be extremely dangerous in the United States. Many eternity clauses are basically aspirational, and that cannot harm, but can sometimes harm if some people, like constitutional courts, start taking aspirations seriously and give them causal efficacy in jurisdiction. I would say that if conditions ever arise when majority could be gathered for abolishing not the dignity clause in the German constitution, things have already go so far that the game is lost. So in that sense, it's sort of pointless to have it.
I'm a little bit concerned with which actors you're trying to analyze with your model. Actors. So is it the individual actor or is it the revolutionary body? Because let's take the example of the Russian Revolution, for instance. Certainly there was a certain amount of people which were motivated towards certain ideals which they were sharing. But when it comes to the constitutional assembly or the whole process which was followed in order for the Constitution to be formed, there were different actors. I cannot believe that the consensus from the basis of the revolutionaries was, for instance, atheists, to a point where they would make it a constitutional point that atheism would be established in a strongly Orthodox country, for instance, Christian Orthodox country. So then it becomes more of a matter of the process of forming the Constitution. So although I do understand the part that there needs to be extreme emotional involvement for all the actors involved, I cannot see how you can distinguish between the individual actors like Lenin, for instance, and the mass actors which actually participated in the revolution, but they weren't really heard in the process.
Well, doing micropolitics is extremely difficult. I think the best people currently doing that kind of work is Ivan Ermakov, who wrote a wonderful book, Micropolitics of the Abdication by the Reichstag in 1933 and the Assemblée Nationale in 1940, really following more or less individual by individual to some extent from day to day. It's very difficult. Ermakov is the best. He did something similar recently for the night of August 4th, trying to trace the debate minute to minute almost. Now, that's an ideal that in practice is extremely difficult to even approximate. But it should be, I think, what inspires or guides scholarship to find out sources and documents that might illuminate these individual motivations. And people have done very good jobs at triangulating members of the French Constituent Assembly by diaries, by letters, by their votes, by all sorts of things. And Timothy Tackett in particular has done a wonderful job of sort of reconstructing not just the groups, but also many individuals. Now, there's another aspect of this which bothers me more, and that has to do with the fact that in modern constituent assemblies, there are no individuals. They're just committees and parties, and they are black boxes. It's very hard to understand constitution making in modern contemporary assemblies because of these two factors. And the golden age of deliberating assemblies ended, according to Carl Schmitt, in 1919 or something. So that was a golden age. And then later, as I said, working committees, which are shielded from passion to a large extent, deliberately so, and parties, which I'm sure have their share of passion, but also are black boxes. So it's a very tricky issue that you raise, and I'm fully aware of the difficulties, but you have to be, nevertheless, think with that ideal in mind to move a little bit closer to it.
So I'd just like to thank Jon very much for giving such a stimulating presentation. I know whenever I've read any of his works, it's always left me with lots of questions, lots of challenges, and I think he's demonstrated really why you're such an immense figure actually in all of social science in the last 30 to 40 years. So I'd like us all to give a very warm thank you for Jon for spending the time to speak to us.
I'd just like to make one concluding observation. In spite of my sort of fumbling presentation, I hope you understand that I think this is fun.